The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening, and Maya pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stood outside the fancy restaurant. Through the big glass windows, she could see people in expensive clothes eating their dinner, laughing and talking without a care in the world. Her stomach made a loud rumbling sound that seemed to echo in the empty street. She hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. The last of her money had gone to pay for a cheap motel room, and even that was only for one night. Tomorrow she'd be back on the streets with nowhere to go. Maya looked down at her worn sneakers, the ones with the hole near the toe that let the rainwater seep in. Everything she owned was in the small backpack on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Maya pushed open the heavy glass door. A wave of warm air hit her face, along with the smell of fresh bread and grilled meat that made her mouth water. The restaurant was busy, filled with the sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversations. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and soft piano music played in the background. The hostess at the front desk looked up from her computer screen. She was a young woman about Maya's age, but everything about her screamed money. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was flawless, and her black dress probably cost more than Maya used to make in a month. The hostess's smile faded quickly when she saw Maya's appearance. "Can I help you?" the hostess asked, her voice cold and distant. She looked Maya up and down, taking in the wet hair, the old clothes, and the backpack. Her nose wrinkled slightly as if Maya smelled bad. Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to speak. "I was wondering if maybe I could play piano for you tonight. In exchange for some food?" Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, almost like a whisper. The hostess blinked a few times like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Excuse me?" "I can play piano," Maya said, speaking a little louder this time. "I'm really good at it. I just need something to eat, and I thought maybe—" The hostess let out a short laugh. "You want to play piano for food?" She said it loud enough that some of the nearby customers turned to look. "Like some kind of street performer?" Maya's face got even redder. "I'm not a street performer. I actually went to music school, and my father was—" "Hold on," the hostess interrupted, holding up one perfectly manicured hand. "Let me get my manager. This is too good to pass up." Maya wanted to run. Every instinct in her body told her to turn around and walk out of that restaurant before things got worse. But her stomach growled again, louder this time, and she remembered that she hadn't even had a sip of water since morning. She stayed put. The hostess disappeared into the back of the restaurant, and Maya could hear her talking excitedly to someone. A few of the customers were still staring at her, whispering to each other behind their hands. An older man in an expensive suit nudged his wife and pointed in Maya's direction. 2 women at a corner table had stopped eating their salads and were looking at her like she was some kind of zoo animal. After what felt like forever, the hostess came back with a tall man in his 50s. He was wearing a crisp white shirt and a tie, and his hair was slicked back with gel. This had to be the manager. He had the same look on his face that the hostess did, like he was watching something amusing happen. "So you're the young lady who wants to play piano for dinner?" the manager said, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was loud enough that even more people turned to look. "That's quite an interesting proposal." Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice shaking. The manager walked around her slowly, like he was inspecting her. "And you think you're good enough to entertain our guests? Our usual pianist has been playing for 20 years. He's performed all over the world." "I know I don't look like much right now," Maya said, finding her voice again. "But I really can play. I've been playing since I was 4 years old." The manager chuckled. "Since you were 4? Well, aren't you something special?" He turned to address the dining room, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat tonight. This young woman here thinks she can entertain you with her piano skills in exchange for a meal." The restaurant got quieter as more people stopped their conversations to listen. Maya felt like she was shrinking under all the stares. Some people were smiling, but not in a nice way. They looked like they were waiting for something funny to happen. A man at a table near the window called out, "What's she going to play, chopsticks?" His table erupted in laughter. "Maybe happy birthday?" Another voice added, causing more giggles around the room. Maya's hands were shaking now, but she clenched them into fists to make it stop. She thought about her father, about all those hours they'd spent together at the piano when she was little. He always told her that music was a gift, something that could touch people's hearts and souls. Right now, though, it felt more like a curse. The manager was clearly enjoying the show. Well, what do you say, folks? Should we let our aspiring pianist here give it a try? He asked the question like he was a game show host, gesturing grandly toward the dining room. Why not? Someone shouted from the back. This should be entertaining. As long as she doesn't break the piano, another person added, causing more laughter. Maya wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, but then her stomach growled again so loud that the hostess actually took a step back. Maya hadn't just eaten in 2 days, she realized. When was the last time she'd had a real meal? Last week, the week before? Everything was starting to blur together. All right then, the manager said, clearly pleased with himself. Let's see what you've got. The piano is right over there in the corner. He pointed to a beautiful black grand piano that sat near the windows. But I have to warn you, if you're wasting our time, you'll need to leave immediately. Maya nodded and walked toward the piano, feeling like every eye in the restaurant was following her. Her backpack felt heavier with each step, and her wet shoes squeaked against the polished floor. Behind her, she could hear people pulling out their phones, probably getting ready to record whatever disaster was about to happen. The piano bench was covered in soft black leather, and when Maya sat down, she almost cried with relief. It had been months since she'd sat at a real piano. The keyboard cover was already open, revealing the pristine black and white keys that seemed to glow under the soft lighting. Maya placed her hands on her lap and took a deep breath. She could still hear people talking and laughing behind her, but she tried to block it out. Instead, she thought about her father's voice, the way he used to say her name when she played something beautiful. She thought about all the music that lived inside her, waiting to come out. The restaurant grew quieter as people realized she was about to begin. Some were probably expecting her to fail spectacularly. Others might have been hoping for at least a few minutes of decent background music. None of them were prepared for what was about to happen. The manager clapped his hands together loudly, getting everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," he announced with a big smile on his face. He was clearly loving every second of this. "We have a very special performance tonight from our unexpected guest here." Maya felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She kept her hands in her lap, trying to stop them from shaking. The piano bench felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. It had been so long since she'd played on a real piano, especially one this beautiful. "Now I have to tell you," the manager continued, walking around like he was putting on a show, "our regular pianist called in sick tonight. Roberto has been playing here for 15 years. He studied at the finest music schools in Europe." He paused for effect, looking around the room, but apparently we have someone even more talented right here. The sarcasm in his voice was thick, and it made Maya's stomach twist into knots. She could hear people chuckling and whispering to each other. Someone near the bar said something she couldn't quite make out, but it was followed by loud laughter. A woman at a table by the wall called out, "What's she going to play for us? Mary had a little lamb." Her friends at the table burst into giggles, covering their mouths with their hands like they were trying to be polite but failing. "Oh, I hope she knows Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," another voice added from somewhere behind Maya. "That's about as complicated as most people can handle." Maya's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wanted to stand up and walk out, but where would she go? She had nowhere to sleep tonight. No money for food and no one to call for help. This was her only chance, even if it meant becoming entertainment for a room full of strangers who thought she was a joke. The manager held up his hands for quiet. Now, let's give our performer a chance," he said. But his tone made it clear he was expecting this to be a disaster. "What's your name, young lady?" "Maya," she said quietly, not turning around to face the room. "Speak up." "Maya, we can't hear you back here," the manager said loudly. "My name is Maya," she repeated, a little louder this time. "Well, Maya, what are you going to play for us tonight? Please tell me you know something more challenging than hot cross buns." The manager's comment got another round of laughter from the crowd. Maya finally turned around to face the dining room. The sight of all those people staring at her made her feel sick. Most of them had their phones out now, cameras pointed in her direction. Some were already recording, probably planning to post videos online of the homeless girl who thought she could play piano. There was an older couple near the window who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. The woman kept nudging her husband and whispering something that Maya couldn't hear. But most of the other customers seemed to be enjoying the show. They were grinning and waiting for her to make a fool of herself. "I was thinking of playing some classical music," Maya said, her voice barely carrying across the room. "Classical music," the manager repeated dramatically. "How ambitious. Do you know any Beethoven? Mozart, perhaps?" He said the names like they were jokes. "Actually, yes," Maya said, and for the first time that evening, her voice was steady. "I know quite a bit of both." This got an even bigger reaction from the crowd. Someone actually snorted with laughter. A man in an expensive-looking suit shook his head and said to his dinner companion, "This is going to be painful to watch." The hostess, who was still standing near the front desk, pulled out her own phone and started recording. "This is definitely going on social media," she said to another employee who had come out from the kitchen to see what all the fuss was about. Maya noticed that even the waiters and busboys had stopped working to watch. They were standing along the walls trying to look busy, while obviously waiting to see what would happen. Some of them looked sorry for her, but others seemed just as entertained as the customers. "Well then, Maya," the manager said, spreading his arms wide like a circus ringmaster. "The stage is yours. Show us what 15 years of experience looks like." He was referring to their regular pianist, making it clear that he thought Maya couldn't possibly measure up. Maya turned back to the piano and stared at the keys. They looked perfect, like they'd been polished that morning. She could see her reflection in the black surface of the piano, and she looked exactly like what she was, a desperate, tired young woman who hadn't had a real meal in days. Behind her, the conversation was getting louder again. People were placing bets on how long she'd last before giving up. Someone said they'd give her 30 seconds before she ran out crying. Another person said she'd probably just play a few random notes and call it music. "I bet she doesn't even know how to read music," a woman's voice said clearly. "She probably thinks she can just bang on the keys and make something that sounds good. My 5-year-old nephew could probably play better than this," someone else added. Maya closed her eyes and tried to block out all the voices. She thought about her father, about the countless hours they'd spent together at their old upright piano in their tiny apartment. She remembered how his face would light up when she played something perfectly, how proud he'd look when she mastered a particularly difficult piece. Her father had always told her that music wasn't about impressing people or showing off. It was about sharing something beautiful with the world, about touching people's hearts in a way that words never could. But right now, all these people wanted was a show. They wanted to laugh at her, to record her failure and share it with their friends. Maya opened her eyes and looked at the keys again. Her hands were still shaking, but now it was more from anger than fear. These people had no idea who she was or what she'd been through. They saw her old clothes and her backpack and decided she was worth nothing more than their entertainment. Well, maybe it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. Maya lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The piano was perfectly in tune, and even that light touch produced a beautiful, clear sound. For just a moment, the room got a little quieter, like people were holding their breath to see what would happen next. "Here we go," she heard someone mutter. "This should be good." Maya took one more deep breath and closed her eyes again. When she opened them, everything had changed. She wasn't thinking about the hungry, desperate girl who had walked into this restaurant begging for food. She wasn't thinking about the crowd of people behind her waiting for her to fail. Instead, she was thinking about the music that lived inside her, the melodies and harmonies that had been her constant companions through every difficult moment of her life. This was her chance to let that music out, to share it with the world, even if the world wasn't ready to listen. Maya's fingers hovered over the keys for what felt like an eternity. The restaurant had grown surprisingly quiet, with only the soft clinking of silverware and the occasional whisper breaking the silence. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing to peek through the service window. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her back, some curious, others skeptical, and many just waiting for the entertainment to begin. Phone cameras were still recording, ready to capture whatever disaster was about to unfold. The manager stood off to the side with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face like he was already planning how he'd tell this story to his friends later. Maya closed her eyes one more time and let her mind drift back to when she was 7 years old. Her father had just taught her a new piece, something beautiful and complex that she'd been struggling with for weeks. When she finally played it perfectly, he had tears in his eyes. Music is not about the notes on the page, he had told her. It's about the feeling behind those notes. Always remember that, little one. Taking the deepest breath of her life, Maya let her fingers find their home on the keyboard. The first note that emerged was soft and pure, a single tone that seemed to fill every corner of the restaurant. It was the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always been close to her heart. The effect was immediate and shocking. Every conversation stopped. Every fork was set down. Even the background noise from the kitchen seemed to fade away. That one perfect note hung in the air like a crystal bell, and suddenly everyone realized they were about to witness something very different from what they had expected. Maya's left hand joined in with a gentle accompaniment, and then her right hand began the famous melody that had moved hearts for over a century. But this wasn't just someone playing the notes correctly. This was something much deeper, much more profound. Maya wasn't just playing music. She was telling a story with her fingers, painting emotions in the air with every phrase. The technique was flawless. Her fingers moved across the keys with the kind of precision and grace that takes decades to develop. Every note was perfectly placed, every dynamic change was exactly right, and every subtle rubato felt completely natural. But more than that, there was something in her playing that went beyond technical skill. There was soul. In the dining room, the change was dramatic. The man who had joked about chopsticks was now leaning forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open. The woman who had laughed about Mary Had a Little Lamb had stopped recording and was just listening, her eyes wide with surprise. Even the hostess had lowered her phone, forgetting about social media for the moment. Maya moved seamlessly from the Chopin into Bach's Prelude in C major, her fingers dancing across the keys with impossible lightness. The piece built and flowed like water, each note connecting to the next in a way that seemed effortless but required years of training to achieve. The restaurant was now completely silent except for the music. An elderly man at a corner table recognized the piece immediately. He had been a music teacher for 40 years before retiring, and he knew exceptional playing when he heard it. He nudged his wife and whispered urgently, "This is professional level. This is conservatory level." Maya wasn't aware of the whispers or the stares anymore. She was lost in the music, transported to a place where hunger and homelessness and desperate embarrassment didn't exist. Her fingers knew exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to slow down or speed up for maximum emotional impact. She transitioned into Debussy's Clair de Lune, and the ethereal beauty of the piece seemed to cast a spell over the entire room. The melody floated and shimmered like moonlight on water, and Maya's interpretation was so sensitive, so nuanced, that several people found themselves holding their breath without realizing it. A young woman at the bar had tears forming in her eyes. She had heard this piece countless times, but never like this. Never with such pure emotion and technical mastery combined into something that felt almost magical. She looked around the room and saw that she wasn't alone in her reaction. The manager's expression had completely changed. The smugness was gone, replaced by confusion and growing amazement. This wasn't what he had expected at all. This wasn't a desperate homeless person fumbling through simple songs. This was a master musician, performing at a level that belonged in concert halls, not casual restaurants. Maya moved into Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, and the dramatic, powerful chords that opened the piece made several people jump in their seats. Her hands moved with incredible speed and precision, navigating the complex passages that would challenge even professional pianists. The music was dark and stormy, full of passion and intensity that seemed to pour directly from her soul. A classical music professor who had been dining with his wife set down his wine glass completely. He had heard this prelude performed by some of the world's best pianists, and what he was hearing now was easily at that level. The technical demands of the piece were enormous, requiring not just fast fingers but incredible strength and control. Yet Maya played it like it was as natural as breathing. "Who is this girl?" he whispered to his wife, but she could only shake her head in amazement. The entire restaurant staff had gathered to listen. Waiters stood frozen with plates in their hands. Busboys leaned against door frames, and even the head chef had come out of the kitchen. None of them had ever experienced anything like this in their workplace. Maya finished the Rachmaninoff and paused for just a moment, her hands resting on the keys. The silence in the restaurant was complete and profound. You could hear a pin drop. Then, without any announcement or explanation, she began to play Liszt's Liebestraum No. 3, one of the most beautiful and challenging romantic pieces ever. written. The melody was so achingly beautiful that it seemed to reach into everyone's chest and squeeze their hearts. Maya's interpretation was mature beyond her years, full of longing and tenderness that spoke to something universal in the human experience. Her technique was absolutely flawless, but it was the emotional depth of her playing that truly captivated the audience. People had completely forgotten about their phones, their dinners, their conversations. The wealthy diners who had been ready to mock a homeless person were now witnessing something that many of them had only heard in the world's finest concert halls. The hostess stood transfixed, her phone hanging forgotten in her hand. As Maya played, something magical happened in that restaurant. All the barriers that had existed between the well-dressed customers and the desperate young woman at the piano began to dissolve. The music created a connection that went beyond social class, beyond appearance, beyond everything that had seemed to matter just minutes before. When Maya finally let the last note of the Liebestraum fade into silence, the restaurant remained absolutely still for several long seconds. Nobody seemed to know how to react to what they had just witnessed. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process the fact that their assumptions about this young woman had been completely and utterly wrong. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. The applause started slowly. Just one person clapping, then another, and then suddenly the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous appreciation. People were standing up from their tables, some with tears streaming down their faces, others just shaking their heads in complete disbelief. The sound was overwhelming after the perfect silence that had filled the room during Maya's performance. Maya remained seated at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, looking almost surprised by the reaction. She had been so lost in the music that she had forgotten where she was, forgotten about the crowd of skeptical strangers who had been expecting her to fail. Now, faced with their enthusiastic applause, she felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "Extraordinary," the elderly music professor whispered to his wife, still clapping vigorously. "Absolutely extraordinary. I haven't heard playing like that since—" He trailed off, trying to remember the last time he had witnessed such a combination of technical brilliance and emotional depth. The manager stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. This was not the outcome he had expected when he decided to humiliate what he thought was a delusional homeless person. Instead, he had just witnessed one of the most incredible musical performances of his life. A well-dressed woman at a table near the piano wiped tears from her eyes and called out, "That was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful." Her voice was full of genuine emotion, and she seemed almost embarrassed by how moved she had been. Maya slowly turned around on the piano bench to face the room. The faces looking back at her were completely different from the ones that had been mocking her just 20 minutes earlier. Where there had been skepticism and amusement, now there was respect and amazement. Where there had been phones recording her expected failure, now there were people applauding her incredible success. Thank you," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "Don't stop," someone called out from the back of the restaurant. "Please keep playing." "Yes, more," another voice added. "That was incredible." Maya looked around the room, still feeling like she was in a dream. These were the same people who had been laughing at her, making jokes about her appearance, expecting her to embarrass herself. Now they were looking at her like she was some kind of miracle. The applause gradually died down, but people remained standing, waiting to see what would happen next. Maya turned back to the piano and after a moment's hesitation began to play again. This time she chose Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, starting with the famous first movement that everyone in the room would recognize. But Maya didn't play it the way most people had heard it before. Her interpretation was fresh and alive, bringing new life to a piece that was over 200 years old. Every phrase was perfectly shaped. Every ornament was placed with exquisite taste. And the overall effect was both elegant and deeply moving. The waitress who had been serving the table near the window stopped what she was doing and leaned against the wall to listen. She had never been particularly interested in classical music, but something about Maya's playing made the music accessible and beautiful in a way she had never experienced before. During the more virtuosic passages, Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard with incredible speed and accuracy. The difficult runs and complex ornaments that challenged even professional pianists seemed to flow effortlessly from her hands. It was clear that she possessed not just musical sensitivity, but also the technical skills that took decades to develop. "How is this possible?" the head chef whispered to one of his sous chefs. "Where did she learn to play like that?" When Maya finished the Mozart, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. People were beginning to realize that what they were witnessing wasn't just one good performance, but evidence of truly exceptional musical ability. This wasn't someone who had learned a few pieces to impress people. This was a serious musician with years of intensive training. Without waiting for the applause to die down completely, Maya moved into Chopin's Ballade No. 1, one of the most challenging and beloved pieces in the piano repertoire. The opening was gentle and mysterious, drawing everyone in the room into the musical story that was about to unfold. As the piece developed, Maya's playing revealed layers of complexity and emotion that few people in the restaurant had ever heard in live performance. The technical demands of the piece were enormous, requiring not just fast fingers but incredible control and musical understanding. Maya met every challenge with apparent ease, her interpretation both powerful and deeply personal. The classical music professor was now taking notes on his napkin, trying to remember every detail of what he was hearing. "The phrasing is remarkable," he whispered to his wife, "and the way she handles the climaxes. It's like she understands every note, every harmony, every subtle detail of the composition." A young couple at a corner table had stopped eating entirely and were just listening with complete focus. Neither of them knew much about classical music, but they could tell they were experiencing something special. The emotion in Maya's playing was so direct and honest that it spoke to them in a language that transcended their lack of musical education. Maya moved seamlessly from the Chopin into Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, starting with the famous slow movement that everyone recognized. But even this familiar piece sounded new and fresh under her fingers. Her touch was so sensitive, her sense of timing so perfect, that every note seemed to have special meaning. When she reached the explosive final movement, the contrast was dramatic and thrilling. Maya's hands moved with incredible power and precision, navigating the rapid passages and complex rhythms that made this movement so challenging. The dynamic range she achieved was enormous, from the softest whispers to thunderous climaxes that seemed to shake the room. An older gentleman who owned several music venues in the city was frantically typing notes into his phone. He had been in the music business for 30 years, and he knew exceptional talent when he heard it. This young woman wasn't just good, she was potentially world-class. The busboy who had been clearing tables near the piano had given up any pretense of working and was now standing completely still, mesmerized by the music. He had grown up listening to his grandmother play piano, but he had never heard anything like this. Maya's playing seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart. As Maya played, something remarkable was happening throughout the restaurant. The barriers between the performers and the audience, between the servers and the customers, between people of different backgrounds and social classes, were dissolving in the face of something universally beautiful. Music was creating connections that conversation never could. The hostess who had been so dismissive earlier was now filming again, but this time it wasn't to mock or embarrass. She was capturing something extraordinary, something that she knew people would find hard to believe unless they saw it themselves. When Maya finally brought the Beethoven to its powerful conclusion, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something truly special, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Then the applause began again, even more enthusiastic than before, and this time it was mixed with calls of bravo and incredible. Maya remained at the piano, overwhelmed by the response, still hardly able to believe that the same people who had been laughing at her were now giving her a standing ovation. The transformation was complete. In the span of less than an hour, Maya had gone from being an object of ridicule to being recognized as the extraordinary musician she truly was. But the biggest surprises were still to come. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever. People were clapping so hard their hands hurt, but they couldn't stop. The sound filled every corner of the restaurant, drowning out everything else. Maya sat at the piano bench, turning slowly to look at all the faces around her, still not quite believing what was happening. The change in the room was absolutely incredible. These were the same people who had been snickering and making jokes just an hour ago. But now they looked at her with genuine respect and admiration. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, others were shaking their heads in amazement, and a few were still standing with their mouths open in shock. The well-dressed woman who had joked about Mary had a little lamb was now approaching the piano with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I had no idea. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Maya looked up at her, not knowing what to say. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it gently on top of the piano. "This isn't enough," she said. "Nothing could be enough for what you just gave us." Suddenly, other people began approaching the piano as well. An elderly man in an expensive suit walked over and placed a $50 bill next to the 20. "Young lady," he said, his voice full of respect, "I've been to Carnegie Hall. I've heard the New York Philharmonic, and what you just played was every bit as good as anything I've heard there." More money began appearing on the piano. $5 bills, 10s, 20s, even a few hundreds. People weren't just tipping her. They were expressing their gratitude for something that had truly moved them. A middle-aged couple approached together, each placing money on the growing pile. "We've been married for 25 years, the woman said, "and we've never experienced anything like that together. Thank you for giving us that moment." Maya stared at the money accumulating on the piano. There was already more cash there than she had seen in months. But more than the money, it was the looks on people's faces that overwhelmed her. The same faces that had been cold and dismissive were now warm and kind. The manager, who had been standing in shocked silence, finally approached the piano. His whole demeanor had changed completely. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Miss," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. A huge apology. I had no right to treat you the way I did." He gestured toward the dining room. "None of us did. We made assumptions based on things that don't matter at all." He paused, looking genuinely upset with himself. "You are clearly an exceptional musician, and I would be honored if you would accept not just a meal, but the finest meal our kitchen can prepare." The hostess, who had been so cold earlier, was now standing nearby, looking embarrassed and ashamed. She approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly. "I was awful to you when you came in. I judged you without knowing anything about you." Maya wasn't sure how to respond to all the apologies. Part of her was still angry about how she'd been treated, but another part of her understood that these people had learned something important tonight. They had learned not to judge someone based on their appearance or circumstances. The classical music professor who had been taking notes finally worked up the courage to approach. "Excuse me," he said, his voice full of professional curiosity, "but I have to ask, where did you study? Your technique is absolutely flawless, and your musical interpretation is mature beyond your years." Maya felt a familiar pain in her chest when she thought about her musical education. "I studied at the Riverside Conservatory," she said quietly, "but I had to leave before I graduated." "Riverside?" The professor's eyes widened. "That's one of the finest music schools in the country. But why did you have to leave?" Maya looked down at her hands, which were still resting on the piano keys. "Family circumstances," she said simply. She wasn't ready to tell the whole story to a room full of strangers, no matter how kind they were being now. A young man who owned a music venue across town had been listening to the conversation. "Miss, I don't know what your current situation is, but I run a jazz club downtown. We have open mic nights, but we also have featured performers. If you're interested, I would love to talk to you about playing for us." "Same here," said a woman who had been sitting near the window. "I book musicians for private events, weddings, corporate parties, things like that. I have clients who would pay very well for the kind of performance you just gave." Suddenly, everyone seemed to want to talk to Maya. Business cards started appearing along with the money on the piano. A music teacher offered to give her free lessons, even though it was clear she didn't need them. A woman who ran a music therapy program wanted to know if she'd be interested in volunteer work. A man who owned a piano store said he had instruments she could practice on anytime she wanted. The transformation wasn't just in how people were treating Maya. It was in how they were treating each other too. Strangers were talking to each other about the music they had just heard. The businessman was discussing classical composers with the young couple at the corner table. The waitress was asking the music professor to recommend some recordings she should listen to. Maya had created something magical in that room. Her music had reminded everyone of their shared humanity, of the things that connected them rather than the things that divided them. The artificial barriers between rich and poor, between the servers and the served, between the educated and the uneducated, had all melted away in the face of something beautiful. "Would you play something else?" asked a teenage girl who had been dining with her parents. "Please?" That was the most amazing thing I've ever heard. "Yes, please," echoed several other voices. "Just one more piece." Maya looked around the room at all the expectant faces. These people weren't asking her to perform for their entertainment anymore. They were asking her to share her gift with them, to give them another moment of the beauty she had already provided. She turned back to the piano and thought about what to play. She wanted to choose something that would show these people that music wasn't just about technical skill or impressive performances. It was about communication, about sharing emotions and experiences that couldn't be expressed in words. Maya began to play Für Elise, Beethoven's simple but beloved piece that almost everyone in the room would recognize. But she didn't play it simply. Her interpretation was fresh and personal, bringing new life to a melody that most people had heard hundreds of times before. As she played, Maya noticed that people weren't just listening anymore. They were feeling. Some were swaying slightly to the music. Others had closed their eyes to focus better on the sound. A few were holding hands with their dinner companions, connected by the shared experience of something beautiful. When she finished, the applause was different this time. It was warmer, more personal, like the appreciation you'd give to a friend who had just shared something special with you. Maya felt for the first time in months like she belonged somewhere. The money on the piano had grown into a substantial pile, but more importantly, Maya had a stack of business cards and phone numbers from people who wanted to help her rebuild her musical career. The manager had already arranged for the kitchen to prepare a feast for her, and several people had invited her to come back and play again soon. But the most important change was in Maya herself. For the first time since her father died, she felt like a musician again. Not just someone who could play piano, but someone whose music could touch people's hearts and bring them together. She had almost forgotten that feeling, and having it back was worth more than all the money and job offers in the world. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped by the piano to thank Maya personally. Some shook her hand, others gave her gentle hugs, and a few just looked into her eyes and nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Maya realized that she had given these people something precious tonight, but they had given her something precious too. They had reminded her who she really was. As the applause finally died down, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. Where there had once been skeptical chatter and barely concealed mockery, now there was an almost reverent quiet. People seemed reluctant to return to their normal conversations, as if speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell that Maya's music had cast over the room. The manager approached the piano again, this time with genuine respect in his voice. "Maya, I hope you'll forgive me for asking, but I have to know, where did you learn to play like that? I mean, I've heard professional pianists who couldn't match what you just did." Maya shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. She wasn't used to being the center of positive attention, and all these questions were making her feel exposed in a different way than the mockery had. "I've been playing since I was very young," she said softly. "My father taught me." "Your father must be an incredible teacher," said the classical music professor, who had moved closer to hear the conversation. "To develop that level of technique and musical understanding, it takes years of intensive study with a master." Maya's expression grew distant and she looked down at her hands. "He was a good teacher," she said quietly. "He taught me everything." The professor noticed the past tense in her voice and felt a pang of sympathy, but he was also burning with professional curiosity. "Forgive me for asking, but what's your father's name? With talent like yours, he must be well known in classical music circles." Maya hesitated. She had spent the last 2 years trying to make it on her own, trying to step out from under her father's shadow and prove that she could succeed based on her own merits. Revealing his identity would change everything, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. He's not performing anymore," she said finally. A well-dressed woman who had been listening to the conversation stepped forward. "Maya, I'm sorry if this is too personal, but are you currently working as a musician? Because if you're not, you absolutely should be. What we just heard was extraordinary." "I've been trying to find work," Maya admitted. "It's been difficult." The man who owned the jazz club pulled out his phone. Can I get your contact information? I'm serious about wanting you to play at my venue. We have a regular Friday night slot that pays well, and after hearing you tonight, I know you'd pack the house. Maya realized she didn't have a phone number to give him. She didn't even have a permanent address. The reality of her situation came flooding back, making her feel small and ashamed again despite the evening's triumph. I don't have a phone right now, she said quietly. I've been going through some difficult times. The restaurant fell silent as people began to understand that Maya's shabby appearance and desperate request for food weren't just unusual circumstances. They were signs of real hardship. The businessman who had joked about her playing earlier now looked stricken with guilt. Are you homeless? Asked the teenage girl who had requested another song, her voice full of concern rather than judgment. Maya nodded, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. For the past few months, yes, the revelation sent a ripple of shock through the room. Here was someone with world-class musical abilities living on the streets. It didn't make sense to any of them. How could someone so talented end up in such circumstances? The manager shook his head in disbelief. This is unacceptable. Someone with your abilities should never have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. He paused, thinking quickly. Maya, I'd like to offer you a job. Not just tonight, but a regular position. Our pianist Roberto is getting older, and he's been talking about cutting back his hours. We could use someone with your skills. That's very generous, Maya said, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. But I should tell you, I don't just play classical music. I mean, I can play other styles too, but classical is what I know best. After what we just heard, I don't care if you only play nursery rhymes, the manager replied with a smile. You could play anything and it would be beautiful. The music teacher who had offered free lessons approached again. Maya, I hope you don't mind me asking, but if your father taught you to play at this level, he must have been a professional musician himself. Was he a concert pianist? Maya looked around the room at all the curious faces. These people had shown her such kindness after initially treating her so poorly. Maybe they deserved to know the truth, but she was still afraid of how they might react, afraid that learning about her father might overshadow her own achievements. He was a classical pianist, yes, she said carefully. What was his name? The professor asked gently. I might know his work. Maya took a deep breath. She had kept this secret for so long, trying to make her own way in the world without trading on her father's reputation. But maybe it was time to stop running from who she was. His name was Victor, she said quietly. Victor Kozlov. The professor's face went completely white. His wife, seeing his reaction, grabbed his arm in concern. Several other people in the room who recognized the name gasped audibly. Victor Kozlov? The professor repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The Victor Kozlov? Maya nodded, watching as the shock spread across the faces around her. But that's impossible, said the businessman, who apparently knew something about classical music. Victor Kozlov was one of the greatest pianists of his generation. He performed with every major orchestra in the world. He was legendary. Was, Maya confirmed sadly. He died 2 years ago. The room fell into stunned silence. Victor Kozlov had been a household name in classical music circles, known not just for his incredible technical ability, but for his deep musical sensitivity and innovative interpretations. He had been compared to the great masters of the past, and his recordings were still considered definitive performances of many pieces. You're Victor Kozlov's daughter? The professor asked, still struggling to process this information. I am, Maya said simply. But why didn't you say so earlier? Asked the woman who booked private events. With a name like that, you could have any job in classical music that you wanted. Maya's expression grew sad. Because I wanted to succeed on my own merit, not because of my father's reputation. I wanted people to appreciate my music for what it was, not because of whose daughter I am. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. They had just witnessed one of the most extraordinary musical performances of their lives, from someone they had initially dismissed as a desperate homeless person. Now they learned that she was the daughter of one of the most celebrated pianists in recent history. Your father would be so proud of you, the professor said softly. What you played tonight, it was everything that made his own playing so special. The technique, the emotion, the musical understanding, it's all there. Maya felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. He always said that music was about more than just playing the notes correctly. He said it was about touching people's hearts. Well, you certainly did that tonight, said the hostess, who had been listening to the entire conversation with growing amazement. I've never heard anything so beautiful in my life. The businessman, who owned several music venues, was frantically typing notes into his phone. Maya, I need to ask you something. Have you ever performed publicly? I mean, in real concert settings? Some when I was younger, Maya replied. My father would sometimes let me perform with him at smaller venues. But I never had a solo career. Would you be interested in changing that, he asked? Because I know people who book major concert halls, and after what I heard tonight, I think they would be very interested in meeting you. Maya looked around the room at all the eager faces. Just a few hours ago, she had been desperate and alone, begging for food and being laughed at by strangers. Now these same people were offering her opportunities she had only dreamed of. But more than that, they were looking at her with genuine respect and admiration. Not because they knew who her father was, but because they had experienced her music firsthand. They had seen what she could do, and they wanted to help her share that gift with the world. For the first time in 2 years, Maya began to feel like maybe, just maybe, she might be able to build the life she had always wanted. The name Viktor Kozlov hung in the air like a thunderclap. For several long moments, nobody in the restaurant seemed to know how to react. The classical music professor was the first to break the silence, his voice shaking with emotion. Viktor Kozlov, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words to make sure he had heard correctly. The Viktor Kozlov who performed Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with the Vienna Philharmonic in 2010? The one who recorded what many consider the definitive interpretation of Chopin's complete ballades? Maya nodded quietly, watching as the reality of her revelation sank in around the room. She could see people pulling out their phones, probably looking up her father's name to confirm what they were hearing. But Viktor Kozlov disappeared from the concert circuit about 15 years ago, said the businessman who had been taking notes. Nobody knew what happened to him. There were rumors that he had been injured or that he had some kind of breakdown, but he just vanished from public view. Maya's expression grew distant and sad. He didn't disappear, she said softly. He made a choice. When my mother died, he decided that being a famous concert pianist wasn't as important as being a father. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several people gasped, and the music teacher actually put her hand over her heart. The idea that one of the world's greatest pianists had given up his career to raise his daughter was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He gave up performing to take care of you? Asked the teenage girl, her eyes wide with amazement. He said that music was meant to bring joy, and that the greatest joy in his life was watching me learn and grow, Maya explained. He could have kept touring, kept making recordings, but he wanted to be home with me. He wanted to teach me himself instead of sending me away to study. The professor was shaking his head in wonder. That explains so much about your playing. Viktor Kozlov's technique was legendary, but more than that, he had this incredible ability to find the emotional core of every piece he played. I hear that same quality in your music, Maya smiled sadly. He used to say that the piano was just a tool, like a painter's brush. The real art was in understanding what the composer was trying to express and then finding a way to express it yourself. And he taught you everything? Asked the woman who booked private events. Everything, Maya confirmed. From the time I could reach the keys, he was teaching me. Not just technique, but musical theory, composition, the history behind every piece. He said that to truly understand music, you had to understand the people who created it. The manager was listening to this conversation with growing amazement. So when you said your father was a good teacher, you were talking about one of the most celebrated pianists of the last 50 years. I was talking about the man who taught me that music is a language that everyone can understand, even if they don't realize it, Maya replied. He always said that a good performance should make people feel something, even if they've never heard classical music before. The hostess, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. That's exactly what happened tonight. I don't know anything about classical music, but when you were playing, I felt, I don't even know how to describe it, like the music was telling me a story. That's what my father would have wanted, Maya said. And for the first time that evening, she smiled a genuine, full smile. He always said that the highest compliment a musician could receive was when someone said the music made them feel something. The jazz club owner was frantically Googling on his phone. Maya, I'm looking at your father's biography here, and it says he had a daughter who showed exceptional musical promise. There are mentions of you performing with him when you were very young. Maya nodded. He would sometimes let me play a piece or two during his recitals. Nothing major, just short pieces that he thought I was ready for. He said it was important for me to get comfortable performing for audiences. "I remember now," exclaimed an older woman who had been quiet until this point. "I saw you perform when you were maybe 10 years old. Your father was giving a recital at the Metropolitan Opera House, and you played Mozart's Sonata in C major as an encore. It was absolutely magical. You were so tiny, but you played like a professional." Maya blushed. "I remember that concert. I was so nervous I could barely walk onto the stage. But when I started playing, it felt natural. The newspaper review the next day called you a young prodigy with extraordinary promise," the woman continued. "Whatever happened to your musical career after that?" Maya's expression grew serious again. "My father became ill when I was 16. Cancer. He fought it for 3 years, but during that time music became less important than taking care of him. After he died, I tried to continue my studies at Riverside Conservatory, but..." She trailed off, clearly struggling with painful memories. "But what?" the professor asked gently. "The medical bills from his treatment wiped out everything we had," Maya said quietly. "The house, his piano collection, all of it. I couldn't afford to continue at the conservatory, and I was too proud to ask for help. I thought I could make it on my own, but the music world is harder to break into than I realized, especially without connections or money." The room fell silent as people absorbed this information. Here was the daughter of one of the world's great pianists, reduced to living on the streets because she couldn't afford to pursue her musical education. It was a tragedy that none of them had imagined when she first walked into the restaurant. "That's why you were asking to play for food," the manager said, understanding flooding his voice. "You weren't just some random person trying to get a free meal. You were a trained musician trying to use the only skill you had." "It was my last idea," Maya admitted. "I'd tried everything else. I applied for jobs at music stores, piano teaching positions, anything related to music, but nobody wanted to hire someone who looked like I did. And I couldn't bring myself to tell them who my father was. I wanted to succeed on my own merit." The businessman who owned the music venue stood up from his table. "Maya, I need to tell you something. Your father's recording of Chopin's Nocturnes is what made me fall in love with classical music. I was just a kid when I first heard it, but something about his playing made me understand that music could be more than just entertainment. It could be art." Several other people in the room nodded in agreement. It seemed that Viktor Kozlov's music had touched many lives, and now his daughter was carrying on that legacy in her own way. "He would be so proud of you," the professor said again. "Not just because of your incredible ability, but because of your character. You chose the hard path, trying to make it on your own instead of trading on his reputation. That takes real courage." Maya felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I just wanted to be worthy of his teaching. He gave up so much for me, and I felt like I owed it to him to prove that his sacrifice wasn't wasted." "Maya," said the music teacher softly, "I think you proved that tonight. What you played here wasn't just technically perfect. It had soul. It had meaning. It had everything that made your father's playing so special. You are worthy of his teaching. And more than that, you've made it your own." The revelation of Maya's identity had changed everything, but not in the way she had feared. People weren't looking at her differently because of her famous father. They were looking at her with even more respect because they understood the full magnitude of what she had overcome. She had gone from being the daughter of a celebrity to a homeless young woman to a recognized artist, all in the space of a few hours. But more importantly, she had rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever: the confidence to call herself a musician. Tonight, she hadn't just played music. She had shared her father's legacy while making it uniquely her own. And as she looked around the room at all the faces filled with respect and admiration, Maya realized that maybe, just maybe, her father's sacrifice hadn't been wasted after all. 3 months later, Maya stood in the wings of the Lincoln Center Concert Hall, wearing a beautiful black evening gown that had been a gift from one of the patrons she had met that incredible night at the restaurant. Her hands were steady now, no longer shaking from hunger or fear, but from the natural excitement that came before a major performance. The events that had followed her impromptu concert had unfolded like a dream. Within a week of that evening, she had received more job offers than she could possibly accept. The jazz club owner had given her a regular Friday night slot that paid more than enough to rent a small apartment. The private event coordinator had booked her for 3 weddings and 2 corporate parties. Even the restaurant manager had offered her a permanent position as their featured pianist. But the most significant opportunity had come from the classical music professor, Dr. Richardson, who had been in the audience that night. He had used his connections to arrange for Maya to audition for several major symphony orchestras, and tonight she was making her debut as a featured soloist with the New York Philharmonic. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was performing the same Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 that her father had made famous decades earlier. But she wasn't trying to copy his interpretation. Instead, she was bringing her own understanding to the piece, shaped by everything she had experienced in the years since his death. 5 minutes. Miss Kozlov, the stage manager whispered, and Maya nodded. She had decided to use her father's name professionally, not to trade on his reputation, but to honor his memory and acknowledge the gift he had given her. As she waited in the wings, Maya thought about that desperate evening when she had walked into an upscale restaurant begging for food. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, but it had only been 3 months. Sometimes the most dramatic changes in life happened in the space of a single evening, when everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world suddenly shifted. The money that restaurant patrons had left on the piano that night had been enough to get her back on her feet. She had rented a tiny studio apartment and bought some decent clothes for auditions. But more than the money, it was the confidence she had regained that night that had truly changed her life. "You're on," the stage manager whispered, and Maya walked onto the stage. The concert hall was packed, every seat filled with people who had come to hear the mysterious young pianist who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. The story of her impromptu restaurant performance had spread through classical music circles like wildfire, and tonight's concert had sold out within hours of being announced. As Maya took her place at the beautiful Steinway grand piano, she looked out at the audience and was surprised to see several familiar faces in the front rows. The manager from the restaurant was there along with his wife. The hostess, who had been so dismissive, was sitting next to the jazz club owner. Dr. Richardson was beaming with pride from his seat near the stage. But the biggest surprise was seeing the teenage girl who had asked her to play another song that night. She was sitting with her parents, and when she saw Maya looking in her direction, she gave an enthusiastic wave and a thumbs up. The conductor raised his baton, and Maya placed her hands on the keys. As the orchestra began the opening of the concerto, she felt a familiar sense of peace wash over her. This was where she belonged. This was what her father had prepared her for all those years ago. When her entrance came, Maya's fingers found the keys with absolute confidence. The music that poured forth was everything she had learned from her father, combined with everything she had experienced on her own. It was technically perfect, but more than that, it was deeply personal and emotionally honest. As she played, Maya thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The years of studying with her father, watching him sacrifice his own career to nurture hers. The devastating loss when he died and the struggle to find her own way in the world. The dark months of homelessness and desperation, when she had almost given up on music entirely. And then that magical evening when everything changed. When a room full of strangers had reminded her that music was about connection, about sharing something beautiful with others, about touching hearts and souls in ways that words never could. The concerto built to its spectacular climax, and Maya's playing soared above the orchestra with power and passion. She could feel the audience holding their breath, completely caught up in the music. This was what her father had taught her to strive for, not just technical perfection, but the ability to move people, to make them feel something profound and beautiful. When the final notes faded into silence, the audience erupted in thunderous applause. People leaped to their feet, cheering and calling out, "Bravo!" Maya stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. As she looked out at the sea of enthusiastic faces, she felt her father's presence with her, and she knew he would be proud. The conductor gestured for her to take another bow, and as she did, Maya noticed that many people in the audience were crying. Not tears of sadness, but tears of joy and wonder. Her music had touched them, had given them something beautiful to carry with them. After the concert, Maya was surrounded by admirers, critics, and fellow musicians. Everyone wanted to know about her background, her training, her plans for the future. The reviews that appeared in the newspapers the next day were unanimous in their praise, with several critics comparing her favorably to the greatest pianists of the past century. But the moment that meant the most to Maya came when the teenage girl from the restaurant approached her after the concert. "That was even more beautiful than what you played that night," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "You've inspired me to start taking piano lessons." Maya smiled and gave the girl a hug. "Music is a gift that keeps giving," she said, echoing something her father had often told her. "The more you share it, the more it grows." As Maya left Lincoln Center that night, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She had gone from being homeless and desperate to being recognized as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. Record companies were calling, concert halls were booking her for years in advance, and music critics were already comparing her to her famous father. But the most important change wasn't in her circumstances. It was in her understanding of herself and her purpose. That night in the restaurant had taught her that music wasn't about fame or fortune or impressing people with technical skill. It was about connection, about humanity, about using her gift to bring beauty and joy into the world. She had also learned something important about judgment and assumptions. The people who had laughed at her that night had taught her that everyone deserves a chance to show who they really are, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Now, whenever she performed, she tried to remember that there might be someone in the audience who needed to hear her music, someone who was struggling or lost or looking for hope. Maya's career continued to flourish in the months and years that followed. She performed with major orchestras around the world, recorded several acclaimed albums, and won numerous awards for her playing. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned that desperate evening when she walked into a restaurant asking to play for food. She established a foundation to help young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring that talent and passion wouldn't be limited by financial circumstances. She regularly performed benefit concerts using her gift to raise money for homeless shelters and music education programs. And once a month, Maya returned to that same restaurant where it all began. Not as a desperate young woman begging for food, but as a celebrated artist sharing her music with a new audience. The manager always introduced her the same way. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special performer tonight, someone who reminds us that you should never judge a book by its cover." Maya would smile at the introduction, sit down at the piano, and begin to play, and every time she would watch as the music worked its magic on the audience, breaking down barriers, touching hearts, and reminding everyone in the room of their shared humanity. Because that's what music does. It reminds us that beneath all our differences, beneath our assumptions and prejudices and fears, we are all human beings capable of being moved by something beautiful. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to be the ones creating that beauty for others. Maya had found her purpose, and it was exactly what her father had always known it would be. To use her gift not just to entertain, but to heal, to inspire, and to bring a little more beauty into a world that desperately needed it.